The boardroom was chaos incarnate. 12 men in wool suits, their voices climbing over one another like desperate climbers on a crumbling mountain face. Each one believed his argument was the most compelling, his logic the most sound, his position the most defensible. The air was thick with cigar smoke and thicker still with the stench of anxiety masked as confidence. Papers were being slammed on mahogany tables. Fists were raised. Voices cracked with the strain of men trying to appear larger than they were. This was 1879, and the future of American oil transportation hung in the balance. Railroad magnates had gathered to discuss rates, to negotiate territory, to carve up the continent like surgeons around a patient they all wanted to claim. And in the corner of that room, in a leather chair that seemed too large for any ordinary man, sat John Davison Rockefeller. He had not moved in 17 minutes. He had not spoken in 23. His hands were folded in his lap with the patience of a sphinx. His eyes, pale and calculating, moved slowly from face to face, absorbing every gesture, every twitch, every bead of sweat that formed on the temples of men who thought they were in control. While they shouted, he studied. While they revealed their desperation through volume, he concealed his power through stillness. The others in that room were playing checkers, moving pieces frantically across the board. Rockefeller was playing chess, and he had already seen checkmate 14 moves ahead. His silence was not weakness. It was not confusion. It was not the hesitation of a man unprepared. It was the most sophisticated weapon ever deployed in the theater of human negotiation. And by the time the other men realized what was happening, it was already too late. One by one, they filled the vacuum his silence created. One by one, they revealed their bottom lines, their fears, their true positions. And when Rockefeller finally spoke, after the room had exhausted itself into submission, he spoke just 7 words that would save his company millions and cement his position as the most powerful industrialist in American history. We are about to decode the most dangerous weapon in a negotiator's arsenal, a tool so potent that it has built empires and destroyed kingdoms, a technique so subtle that most people never recognize it, even as it's being used against them. Before we reveal the method that separated Rockefeller from every other businessman of his era, before we pull back the curtain on the psychological warfare that made him the richest man who ever lived, make sure you are subscribed to this channel, because what you're about to learn cannot be found in any business school. It will never be taught in any corporate seminar, and it goes against every instinct that modern society has programmed into you. And I want to know where you are watching from. What city? What country? What corner of the world is hungry enough to learn what old money has always known, but new money constantly forgets? Comment your city below right now. Let me see the global army that's ready to close their mouths and open their minds. Now, let's learn to close our mouths and open our futures. The principle is deceptively simple, almost insultingly so, which is precisely why 98% of the population will never master it. When you speak, you reveal. When you listen, you learn. But this goes deeper than the platitudes your grandmother shared, or the motivational posters in corporate break rooms. This is about information asymmetry, about power dynamics, about understanding that in every human interaction, there exists a delicate economy of knowledge where the person who holds the most information while revealing the least will always, always, always emerge victorious. Rockefeller understood this with a clarity that bordered on religious conviction. He had learned early, painfully early, that the world belonged to those who could control not just their tongues, but the very instinct to fill silence with sound. Most human beings are deeply uncomfortable with quiet. It creates a kind of social pressure that builds in the chest and demands release. We are trained from childhood to fill gaps in conversation, to smooth over awkward pauses, to demonstrate our intelligence and worth through the constant projection of our thoughts. This training is the very mechanism that the powerful use to extract value from the weak. Think about the last negotiation you were in, whether it was for a car, a house, a salary, a contract. Think about how quickly you felt the need to justify your position, to explain your reasoning, to fill the silence with explanations that your counterpart never asked for. Every additional word you spoke was a piece of information you volunteered, a card you turned face up on a table where your opponent kept their hand close to their chest. Every justification you offered was a window into your true position, your real bottom line, your actual level of desperation or desire. The person across from you was simply waiting, watching, collecting data while you handed it over freely, like a tourist showing their wallet to a pickpocket. Rockefeller's father, William Avery Rockefeller, was a con man, a bigamist, a snake oil salesman who disappeared for months at a time and returned with pockets full of money earned through deception. The relationship between father and son was complex, damaged, perhaps even toxic, but it taught young John something that Harvard Business School students pay $200,000 to never truly learn. His father once told him, "I cheat my boys every chance I get. I want to make them sharp." And sharp John became, though not in the way his charlatan father intended. John learned that truth was a currency, that information was power, that the man who controlled the flow of revelation controlled the outcome of every exchange. But where his father used this knowledge for petty cons and temporary gains, John Rockefeller would use it to bend entire industries to his will. The younger Rockefeller rejected his father's flashy dishonesty, but absorbed the underlying principle. He would become the wealthiest man in modern history not through fraud, but through the systematic application of informational advantage. And silence, that golden, terrible silence, was his primary tool for maintaining that advantage. Consider the mechanics of what happens in the human brain when confronted with extended silence during social interaction. Neuroscientists have mapped this response with disturbing precision. The anterior cingulate cortex, the region associated with error detection and emotional processing, begins to fire rapidly when expected social patterns are violated. A conversation is supposed to flow. Questions receive answers. Statements receive acknowledgement. This is the social contract we've all signed without reading the terms and conditions. When someone deliberately breaks this pattern, when someone receives your question or statement with nothing but steady eye contact and measured breathing, your brain interprets this as an error, a system malfunction that requires correction. The correction it demands is more information from you. Your unconscious mind begins scrambling, trying to identify what went wrong, what piece of data the other person is waiting for, what magic phrase will restore the natural order of social exchange. And so you speak again. You elaborate. You justify. You reveal. And the person sitting across from you, the person who understands this game, simply collects what you've offered and waits to see if you'll offer more. Rockefeller had somehow intuited this mechanism long before fMRI machines could prove it. He had discovered through observation and practice that human beings will volunteer almost anything to escape the discomfort of extended silence, and he weaponized this discovery with surgical precision. The railroad negotiation of 1879 was not Rockefeller's first deployment of this technique, but it was perhaps his most legendary. The South Improvement Company scheme had failed, destroyed by public outrage and political pressure, but Rockefeller had learned valuable lessons from that defeat. He learned that power exercise too obviously invites resistance, that control maintained too visibly creates coalitions against you. He needed a more subtle approach, a way to dominate without appearing to dominate, to win without anyone quite realizing they had lost until the game was long over. The railroad barons thought they were meeting with a businessman to negotiate shipping rates. They thought they were dealing with a peer, perhaps even a supplicant who needed their rail lines more than they needed his oil. They were wrong on every conceivable level. When Rockefeller arrived at that meeting, he arrived with a complete understanding of their financial positions, their personal relationships, their debts, their vulnerabilities, their leverage points, and most importantly, their competing interests that prevented them from acting in unified opposition to him. He had spent months gathering this intelligence not through spies or bribery, but through the simple practice of listening, of attending industry events and saying almost nothing while others drank and boasted and revealed. By the time he sat down at that negotiating table, he knew more about their business than they knew about his, and he had accomplished this entirely through the strategic application of silence and attention. The meeting began as they always did, with posturing and chest beating, and the ritualistic display of power that mediocre men mistake for actual power. The railroad men laid out their terms. They spoke of market conditions and operating costs, and the essential nature of their services. They used the word fair repeatedly, which Rockefeller noted as a tell, a verbal tick that suggested they were prepared to move from their initial position, but wanted to be convinced to do so. He said nothing. They presented charts and figures. They gestured dramatically. They filled the room with words, thousands and thousands of words, building a cathedral of rhetoric that they believed demonstrated their strength. Rockefeller examined his fingernails. He looked out the window. He appeared to be thinking deeply, which he was, but not about their arguments. He was thinking about how much longer he could let them talk before they began to crack. The answer, it turned out, was 15 more minutes. The first crack came from the youngest of the railroad magnates, a man named Ashford, who had inherited his position and lacked the seasoning of his colleagues. "Mr. Rockefeller," he said, his voice carrying a tremor of irritation, "we've laid out our position. Don't you have anything to say?" Rockefeller turned his gaze slowly toward Ashford, and the room watched this movement the way an audience watches a gun being drawn in the final act of a play. "I'm listening," Rockefeller said, and returned his eyes to the window. That simple phrase, delivered in a tone that suggested infinite patience, accomplished something extraordinary. It communicated that he was unimpressed, that their grand presentation had not moved him, that they had not yet said anything worth responding to. More importantly, it threw the burden of speech back onto them, and human nature abhors a one-sided conversation. They tried a different approach. They became more aggressive, suggesting that Standard Oil needed them far more than they needed Standard Oil, that alternatives existed, that relationships could be formed with Rockefeller's competitors if terms could not be reached. This was their leverage play, their attempt to create urgency and fear. Rockefeller showed them nothing. His face remained neutral, his posture unchanged, his breath steady. He had learned something that most people never learn. The person who appears most comfortable with walking away from a deal is usually the person who controls that deal. It didn't matter whether he was actually comfortable walking away. What mattered was the performance of comfort, the projection of indifference, and nothing projects indifference quite like silence. The railroad men filled the silence with more talk, and as they talked, they began revealing things they had not intended to reveal. They mentioned specific competitors by name, which told Rockefeller that they had indeed been in discussions with these competitors, but had not yet reached agreements. Otherwise, they would have simply mentioned other parties without specifics. They discussed their operating costs in too much detail, giving Rockefeller insight into their actual margins and therefore their real flexibility on pricing. They checked their pocket watches repeatedly, which indicated they had other appointments, other pressures, other time constraints that Rockefeller did not share. Every minute of his silence was a minute in which they revealed more of their hand, and every revelation shifted the balance of power further in his direction. When Rockefeller finally spoke, after 42 minutes of near-total silence, he did not address their arguments. He did not justify his position. He did not explain why their rates were too high or make a case for why they should lower them. Instead, he simply stated a number, a rate he was willing to pay that was less than half of what they had initially proposed. The railroad men sputtered. They claimed the number was impossible, insulting beneath discussion. And then Rockefeller deployed the second phase of his technique. He stood up. He gathered his coat. He moved toward the door with the unhurried grace of a man who had other options, better options, and no emotional attachment to the outcome of this particular meeting. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. They had spent 42 minutes trying to get him to engage, to argue, to negotiate. His silence had created a kind of anticipation, a building pressure that made his eventual words carry exponential weight. And now those words were being withdrawn. The possibility of agreement, which had seemed so available just moments before, was walking out the door. "Wait," one of them said, and in that single word, Rockefeller knew he had won. The railroad man who spoke, a grizzled veteran named Cornelius McCann, was known throughout the industry as one of the shrewdest negotiators on the East Coast. But even he could not withstand the sophisticated psychological pressure of Rockefeller's silence. "What if we could work with something closer to your number?" McCann asked, and Rockefeller turned back from the door. "I stated my number," he replied, and sat back down. The negotiation continued for another hour, but the outcome had been determined in those first 42 minutes of silence. The railroad men agreed to rates that their shareholders would later question, rates that gave Standard Oil an insurmountable advantage over every competitor, rates that would contribute to Rockefeller's complete domination of the American oil industry within the next decade. New money talks. This is perhaps the most reliable indicator of new money's presence, as consistent as a fingerprint or a DNA marker. New money needs you to know it has arrived, needs you to acknowledge its success, needs validation from the world it has just entered. New money tells you about the car, the watch, the house, the vacation, the investment that paid off, the deal that closed, the insider information that proved prescient. New money is a broadcasting station that never goes off the air because silence might suggest it has nothing to broadcast. And having nothing to broadcast might mean it never really made it after all. Old money whispers. And more often than that, old money says nothing at all. Old money has already been validated by time, by generations, by the very fact of its persistence across decades or centuries. Old money does not need to prove itself to you because your opinion is irrelevant to its continued existence. But more than that, old money understands what new money has not yet learned. Every word spoken is a piece of information offered. Every story shared is a vulnerability revealed. Every boast made is a weakness exposed. Rockefeller, though he had earned his wealth in a single generation, thought like old money from the very beginning. He understood that in a world where information asymmetry determines outcomes, the person who speaks least while observing most will accumulate advantages that compound over time like interest in a well-managed account. Consider how new money approaches a business dinner compared to how someone with Rockefeller's mindset approaches the same event. New money arrives with stories prepared, successes rehearsed, a mental list of accomplishments to strategically mention throughout the evening. The new money individual dominates the conversation, steering it toward topics that allow for subtle or not so subtle demonstrations of wealth, intelligence, connections, and achievements. They leave the dinner believing they have made a strong impression, have established their credibility, have secured their position in the social and business hierarchy. What they don't realize is that while they were performing, someone else was collecting. Someone else was noting the dropped names, the mentioned figures, the casual references to properties and investments and relationships. Someone else was building a psychological profile, identifying pressure points, mapping vulnerabilities, cataloging useful information that might be deployed later in contexts the speaker never anticipated. Rockefeller would arrive at such a dinner and say almost nothing. He would ask simple questions, offer minimal information about his own affairs, and redirect every attempt to discuss his business back toward the other person. People found this deflection charming, this modesty admirable, this reticence a sign of deep wisdom. What they failed to understand was that they were being studied, dissected, understood at a level far deeper than they understood themselves. By the end of the evening, Rockefeller would know their marriage status, their risk tolerance, their relationship with their father, their secret ambitions, their hidden fears, their true financial position despite whatever image they projected. And they would know virtually nothing about him except that he seemed like a very good listener. The vacuum effect is perhaps the most powerful psychological mechanism that silence exploits, and it operates at a level below conscious awareness, which makes it nearly impossible to defend against once you understand you're experiencing it. Nature abhors a vacuum, and human conversation abhors silence. When a pause extends beyond the comfortable 2 to 3 seconds that typically signals a turn-taking in dialogue, A kind of psychological pressure begins to build. The person who has just finished speaking begins to feel responsible for the silence, begins to wonder if they were unclear, if they gave offense, if they failed to adequately communicate their point. This discomfort manifests as a compulsion to speak again, to fill the void, to restore the natural rhythm of conversation. And when they speak again, they almost always reveal more than they intended to reveal in their first statement. This is the vacuum effect, and Rockefeller used it with such consistency that his colleagues began to notice the pattern, began to warn each other about it, but found themselves unable to resist it nonetheless. One associate reportedly prepared himself before a meeting with Rockefeller, promising himself he would wait out any silence, would match Rockefeller's patience with his own. The meeting proceeded, and sure enough, Rockefeller went silent after the associate's initial proposal. The associate held firm. 5 seconds passed, then 10, then 20. The associate was proud of himself, believing he had finally cracked the code, had learned to play Rockefeller's game. And then 30 seconds passed, and then 45, and the pressure became unbearable. And the associate spoke again, and when he spoke, he lowered his initial price without Rockefeller having said a single word. This technique works because silence creates ambiguity, and human beings are hardwired to resolve ambiguity as quickly as possible. When someone doesn't respond to your statement or question, your brain generates multiple possible interpretations simultaneously. Perhaps they didn't hear you. Perhaps they didn't understand you. Perhaps they're insulted. Perhaps they're impressed and considering deeply. Perhaps they're bored. Perhaps they disagree so fundamentally that they don't know where to begin. Perhaps they agree so completely that they see no need to respond. This multiplication of possibilities creates cognitive load, mental strain, emotional discomfort. The quickest way to resolve this discomfort is to speak again, to provide additional context or information that will clarify which interpretation is correct. But in doing so, you give your counterpart more data while they give you nothing in return. The balance of information shifts further in their favor with every second of silence they maintain. Rockefeller understood this instinctively. He would ask a question, receive an answer, and then simply look at the person who had answered, not with suspicion or disapproval, not with skepticism or disagreement, just a neutral, steady gaze that communicated absolutely nothing. And then he would wait. The person who had answered would begin to squirm. They would elaborate. They would qualify. They would add details they had not intended to share. They would reveal their uncertainty, their exaggeration, their deception, or their truth. All Rockefeller had to do was wait and watch. The vacuum did the rest. But silence is not merely the absence of speech, and this is where most people who try to emulate this technique fail catastrophically. Silence without observation is useless. Silence without analysis is a waste of time. Silence as a performance or affectation will be detected and dismissed. The power of Rockefeller's silence came not from the silence itself, but from what he did during those silent moments. He was not passive. He was not zoning out or daydreaming or planning his evening. He was engaged in the most intense form of information gathering available to human beings. He was watching. He watched micro-expressions, those fleeting emotional displays that flash across the human face before conscious control can suppress them. He watched body language, the way people leaned forward or back, crossed or uncrossed their arms, touched their faces or necks or ears. He watched the eyes because the eyes betray us more than any other feature, showing where our attention truly lies, showing our anxiety, our excitement, our deception, our sincerity. He watched patterns of speech, noting when people spoke faster or slower, when their vocabulary became more sophisticated or more casual, when they used qualifiers like honestly or to be perfectly frank, which often signal the opposite. He watched groups, observing the social dynamics, noting who deferred to whom, who interrupted whom, who made eye contact with whom. Every second of silence was a second of data collection. And Rockefeller processed this data with the methodical thoroughness he applied to oil refining, breaking human behavior down into its component parts and extracting useful insight from the raw material of social interaction. There is a famous story, possibly apocryphal but thematically true enough to have persisted for over a century, about Rockefeller meeting with a business partner who was attempting to extract better terms on a deal. The partner made his case, spoke eloquently about market conditions and fair value and partnership and mutual benefit, all the usual arguments that business people make when they want more of something. When he finished, Rockefeller said nothing. The partner waited. 10 seconds passed, 20, 30. The partner shifted in his seat. Rockefeller appeared to be looking at something on the wall behind the partner's head, but his eyes were actually focused in that specific way that indicates deep thought. The partner could not bear it. "Well," he finally said, "what do you think?" Rockefeller continued his silence for another 15 seconds, and when he finally spoke, he said, "I'm thinking." And then he returned to silence. This was psychological warfare of the highest order. The partner had been given just enough acknowledgement to prevent the social contract from being completely shattered, but not enough information to resolve any of his uncertainty. The partner tried to wait. He lasted another 40 seconds before speaking again, this time rephrasing his request, this time lowering his demands, this time revealing that his initial position had been an opening gambit rather than a true requirement. Rockefeller continued thinking. The partner spoke again and again. By the time Rockefeller finally responded with a substantive statement, the partner had talked himself down to a fraction of his original ask, and Rockefeller had not negotiated at all. He had simply let the vacuum do its work. Modern business culture is built on the opposite of this wisdom. We celebrate the articulate, the quick-witted, the confident speaker who can dominate a room with rhetoric and charm. We promote the people who speak well in meetings, who present ideas with polish and conviction, who can craft a narrative and sell a vision. We have created an entire industry of communication coaching, executive speech training, presentation skills development, all focused on making people better at speaking. No one teaches a course on strategic silence. No business school offers a seminar on the power of withholding. No corporate retreat focuses on the competitive advantage of saying less. This is not an oversight. This is by design. The system benefits from people who talk, people who reveal, people who volunteer information freely. The system creates countless mechanisms for information extraction: networking events, conferences, social media, business development meetings, industry mixers, all designed to get people talking, sharing, revealing. The person who understands this is playing a different game than the person who participates enthusiastically in these information harvesting operations. The person who talks freely at every opportunity is the product. The person who listens carefully and speaks minimally is the customer. And in any economic exchange, you want to be the customer, not the product. Rockefeller applied this principle beyond individual negotiations. He built an organization that embodied silence as a core value. Standard Oil became infamous for its secrecy, its refusal to engage with the press, its absolute resistance to revealing information about its operations, finances, strategies, or intentions. While other companies sought publicity and courted journalists, Standard Oil locked its doors and said nothing. This silence created fear among competitors, uncertainty among regulators, and fascination among the public. People don't trust what they can see and understand completely. They respect and fear what remains hidden. Rockefeller understood that mystery is power, that the unknown is more intimidating than the known, that silence creates a space for others to project their fears and assumptions. By revealing nothing, Standard Oil could be everything. Competitors imagined vast resources and infinite cunning. Regulators imagined complex schemes and intricate manipulations. The public imagined ruthless efficiency and cold-blooded calculation. Some of these imaginations were accurate, others were wild exaggerations. But by maintaining silence, by refusing to clarify or explain or justify, Rockefeller allowed all these interpretations to coexist simultaneously, and each interpretation served his interests in different ways. The religious dimension of Rockefeller's silence deserves examination because it reveals something essential about how he maintained this discipline throughout his life. Rockefeller was a devout Baptist, attending church regularly, teaching Sunday school, donating enormous sums to religious institutions and causes. His faith was genuine, not performed or strategic, and it provided him with a philosophical framework that made silence not just a tactic but a virtue. The Bible is full of verses about the power of silence and the danger of excessive speech. Even fools are thought wise if they keep silent, and discerning if they hold their tongues. Sin is not ended by multiplying words, but the prudent hold their tongues. The one who has knowledge uses words with restraint, and whoever has understanding is even-tempered. Rockefeller could pursue his strategy of silence without cognitive dissonance because his religious tradition validated this approach. He was not being manipulative. He was being prudent. He was not being cold. He was being wise. He was not withholding truth. He was avoiding the sin of excessive speech. This religious framework allowed him to maintain his discipline, even when every social instinct screamed at him to speak, to defend himself, to explain, to justify. He could endure the discomfort of silence because he believed he was following a higher principle, following biblical wisdom, following God's design for proper human conduct. But let us be clear about the morality of this technique, because silence can be used for good or evil, for creation or destruction, for building or exploiting. Rockefeller's silence built an empire, but that empire was built partially on the crushed hopes and destroyed businesses of competitors who lacked his sophistication. His silence in negotiations saved his company money, but it also extracted value from counterparties who might have received fairer terms had he been more forthcoming. His organizational silence protected Standard Oil's competitive advantages, but it also concealed practices that would later be deemed illegal and would ultimately result in the company being broken up by the Supreme Court. The tool itself is neutral. The morality comes from the wielder's intentions and the context of its use. A doctor's silence while a patient reveals their complete medical history is virtuous. Con artist's silence while a victim reveals their financial vulnerabilities is predatory. Rockefeller operated in a gray zone, in an era when business ethics were nascent and regulation was minimal, in a context where massive wealth creation and exploitation often occurred simultaneously and were difficult to separate. We can learn from his technique without endorsing all his applications of it. We can recognize the power of silence without using that power to harm others. We can master this tool while maintaining our moral compass, using it to avoid being exploited rather than to exploit, using it to understand rather than to manipulate, using it to create value rather than simply extract it. The modern application of Rockefeller's silence requires adaptation because our world is different from his in ways both obvious and subtle. We live in an age of information overload where everyone is broadcasting constantly, where social media has trained people to share their thoughts in real time without filter or reflection, where the cultural pressure to have an opinion on everything and to share that opinion immediately is overwhelming. This creates both opportunities and challenges for those who would employ strategic silence. The opportunity is that silence is now rarer and therefore more powerful. In a world where everyone is speaking, the person who listens stands out dramatically. In a conversation where everyone is trying to be heard, the person who is comfortable not being heard has enormous advantage. In an environment where people are trained to fill every moment with content, the person who can embrace emptiness becomes magnetic precisely because they are different, unexpected, mysterious. But the challenge is that silence is now more likely to be interpreted negatively. In Rockefeller's era, silence could be seen as wisdom, thoughtfulness, depth. In our era, silence is more likely to be read as disengagement, disinterest, or social awkwardness. The person who says nothing in a meeting might not be seen as deeply thoughtful, but simply as having nothing to contribute. The person who doesn't respond immediately to a message might be seen not as strategic, but as rude or dismissive. Therefore, modern silence must be calibrated differently. It must be deployed selectively rather than universally. It must be combined with other signals that indicate engagement and presence, rather than absence and withdrawal. The technique Rockefeller used, of extended silence that stretched for minutes and created almost unbearable psychological pressure, must now be compressed into shorter intervals that still achieve the same effect without triggering modern interpretations of rudeness or disengagement. This is the art of the strategic pause rather than the extended silence. In a negotiation, instead of saying nothing for 5 minutes after receiving an offer, you might pause for 15 seconds before responding. Those 15 seconds, in our current rapid-fire communication environment, will feel like an eternity to the other person. They will begin to experience that vacuum effect, that uncertainty, that compulsion to fill the space. And when you do speak, your words will carry more weight because they were not immediate, not reflexive, but considered. You have communicated, through that pause, that you are thoughtful, that you do not accept everything at face value, that you process before responding. This creates a subtle power dynamic in your favor, without creating the negative impression that longer silences might now generate. In written communication, the modern equivalent of Rockefeller's silence is delayed response. In an era when people expect instant replies to emails and messages, the person who takes hours or even days to respond is making a statement about the relative value they place on the interaction. This delay, when used strategically rather than habitually, communicates that you have priorities, that you consider carefully before responding, that your time and attention are valuable resources not freely distributed to every request. But this technique, like all others discussed here, requires calibration and intelligence in application. Delay too long or too consistently, and you damage relationships, miss opportunities, appear unreliable or disorganized. The art is in selective deployment, in knowing which communications require immediate response and which benefit from strategic delay, in understanding which relationships can withstand this technique and which require more attentive communication. The principle remains the same as in Rockefeller's time. The person who controls the tempo of communication, who is not reactive but deliberate, who does not feel compelled to respond immediately to every stimulus, maintains a position of power relative to those who are always reactive, always responsive, always available. Social gatherings present the modern practitioner with perhaps the best laboratory for practicing strategic silence, because they are lower stakes than business negotiations, but still rich with opportunity for information gathering and relationship building. The person who arrives at a party or networking event and immediately begins talking, sharing their story, explaining their business, discussing their opinions, is following the modern cultural script perfectly. They are doing exactly what the environment expects and rewards, or appears to reward. They leave feeling satisfied that they made an impression, that people now know who they are, that they successfully represented themselves. Meanwhile, the person who has studied Rockefeller arrives at the same event with a different strategy. They ask questions. They show genuine curiosity about others. They listen not just to the words, but to the meaning behind the words, the emotional context, the subtle revelations. They speak minimally about themselves, deflecting questions with humility and turning attention back to others. They observe group dynamics, noting who has influence, who seeks influence, who is secure in their position, who is insecure and overcompensating. By the end of the evening, the first person has broadcast their entire story to a room full of people who were also broadcasting and therefore barely listening. The second person has collected detailed intelligence about dozens of people, has identified potential allies and threats, has begun to understand the invisible web of relationships and power that structures this particular community, and has done so while revealing almost nothing about themselves. Which person has gained more value from the event? Which person is better positioned for future interactions? Which person has power? The concept of holding frame in modern self-improvement and sales literature is essentially a repackaging of Rockefeller's silence, though often misunderstood and poorly applied. To hold frame means to maintain your own interpretation of reality, your own emotional state, your own agenda, even when others are trying to pull you into their frame, their reality, their agenda, their emotional state. The person who speaks first in a negotiation has typically broken frame, has accepted the responsibility to justify their position, has stepped into the supplicant role of making a case. The person who remains silent maintains frame, communicates that they do not accept this responsibility, that the other party must make the case to them. This is why Rockefeller's extended silences were so devastating. They forced the other party to continue operating in their own frame, to continue making their case, to continue revealing their position, and eventually their desperation. The railroad magnates had to keep talking, because Rockefeller's silence communicated that he had not yet heard anything worthy of response. His frame was, "Your case is insufficient," and his silence maintained that frame without him having to explicitly state it, which would have been less powerful, because it could have been argued with or defended against. Silence cannot be argued with. Silence is a wall that simply exists, and the person on the other side of that wall must either accept it or break themselves against it trying to breach it. The nervous system plays a crucial role in determining who can deploy this technique effectively and who cannot. Silence is uncomfortable not just psychologically but physiologically. When you resist the urge to speak, when you sit in that growing tension as seconds stretch into minutes, your body is in a state of mild stress. Your heart rate elevates slightly. Your breathing wants to quicken. Stress hormones begin to release in small amounts. You feel the compulsion to end this discomfort through speech. The person who can tolerate this physiological discomfort better than their counterpart will win the silence game. This is not about intelligence or even discipline in the traditional sense. This is about nervous system regulation, about the capacity to remain calm and centered in the face of social pressure and internal discomfort. Rockefeller had this capacity in abundance, whether through genetics, early training, religious practice, or some combination of all three. He could sit in that discomfort indefinitely because his nervous system did not interpret the silence as dangerous or even particularly distressing. His competitors, meanwhile, experienced escalating discomfort that eventually became intolerable, forcing them to speak and thereby surrender their advantage. You can train this capacity. Meditation is perhaps the most direct method, teaching the mind to sit with discomfort without reacting, to observe internal sensations without needing to change them, to exist in space that is not filled with activity or stimulus. The person who has meditated regularly for years has a massive advantage in negotiations because they have literally trained their nervous system to tolerate empty space, to sit in the gap between stimulus and response, to resist the automatic urge to act that dominates most people's experience. But there are other methods as well. Deliberate practice of delayed response in low-stakes situations builds the neural pathways that support strategic silence in high-stakes moments. When someone asks you a question, count to 3 before answering. When someone makes a statement, pause before agreeing or disagreeing. When someone presents an offer, sit with it silently before responding. These micro-delays, practiced consistently, train your nervous system to associate silence not with danger or social violation, but with thoughtfulness and power. Over time, the discomfort decreases and the capacity increases. What once required tremendous effort becomes natural, automatic, effortless. You become the kind of person who is comfortable with silence because you have literally rewired your nervous system to support this capacity. But beware the trap of technique divorced from character, because silence deployed by someone of poor character becomes manipulation, and manipulation eventually destroys trust, and therefore destroys the very relationships that might have provided long-term value. Rockefeller's silence worked not just because it was technically sophisticated, but because it was backed by genuine substance. When he finally spoke after extended silence, his words carried weight because they were usually accurate, insightful, and backed by actual capability. He was not faking competence or knowledge. He genuinely had done the work, gathered the information, analyzed the situation, developed the strategy. His silence was the container for real preparation and genuine expertise. If you attempt to use silence without doing the underlying work, without developing real competence and insight, you will be revealed as a fraud relatively quickly. The silence will create anticipation, but when you finally speak, your words will disappoint because they will reveal the emptiness behind the performance. This is why new money's attempts to mimic old money's silence often fail. They copy the external behavior without understanding or developing the internal substance that makes the behavior meaningful. They learn to pause before speaking, but have nothing particularly valuable to say when they do speak. They learn to listen, but don't actually analyze or understand what they're hearing. The technique without the foundation is a costume without a body, impressive from a distance but empty upon closer inspection. The question of ethics returns here because one might reasonably ask whether strategic silence is fundamentally deceptive, whether it represents a form of emotional manipulation that violates the principles of honest dealing. This is a valid concern and deserves serious consideration. The defense of silence as ethical rests on several arguments. First, you have no obligation to reveal everything you know or think in every interaction. Privacy is a right, and maintaining information asymmetry is not inherently unethical, provided you are not actively deceiving through false statements. Silence is not the same as lying. It is simply choosing not to speak, which is a choice every person makes constantly throughout their day. Second, allowing others to reveal themselves freely is not manipulation if you are not coercing or tricking them into revelation. If someone chooses to fill silence with information, that is their choice made freely, even if the silence creates psychological pressure. You are not responsible for their inability to tolerate that pressure. Third, in competitive environments like business negotiations, some degree of information asymmetry is expected and accepted by all parties. Everyone understands that they are trying to get the best deal for themselves, and that this may involve withholding information about their true bottom line, their alternatives, their urgencies. Strategic silence is simply one tool for maintaining appropriate privacy in such contexts. The counterargument is that strategic silence can cross into manipulation when the person deploying it is specifically exploiting psychological vulnerabilities in ways the other party cannot reasonably defend against or even recognize. There is something predatory about using sophisticated understanding of human psychology to extract value from someone who lacks that understanding, particularly in situations where there is already a power imbalance. When Rockefeller used silence to negotiate with railroad magnates, both parties were sophisticated business people with roughly comparable resources and experience. When a trained negotiator uses the same technique against an unsophisticated consumer, the ethics become murkier. This suggests that the ethical application of strategic silence requires consideration of context, relationship, power dynamics, and the vulnerability of the other party. Used between equals in competitive contexts, it is fair play. Used by the powerful against the vulnerable in contexts where trust is expected, it becomes exploitation. The tool itself remains neutral, but the user must maintain moral awareness of how they deploy it. Consider what would have happened if Rockefeller had never learned the power of silence, if he had instead followed the normal human impulse to speak, to justify, to persuade. He would still have been intelligent, hardworking, and strategic. He might still have built a successful company, but would he have built an empire that controlled 90% of American oil refining? Almost certainly not. The additional edge provided by his mastery of information asymmetry, his ability to understand others while remaining incomprehensible to them, his capacity to extract revelation while offering none, was the difference between significant success and absolute domination. This suggests something profound about the nature of power in human society. Technical skill and hard work can get you far, but true dominance requires mastery of the psychological and social dimensions of human interaction. The person who can control information flow, who can manage their own reactions and influence others' reactions, who can sit comfortably in discomfort while others squirm, operates at a level above mere competence. They are playing chess while others play checkers, and the gulf in outcomes reflects this difference in sophistication. Your own practice must begin with awareness, because you cannot change what you do not notice. For the next week, pay attention to your patterns in conversation. Notice when you feel compelled to fill silence. Notice when you speak without being asked. Notice when you volunteer information that was not requested. Notice when you justify or explain without prompt. Notice when you answer questions that were not quite asked. Notice the physical sensation that accompanies the urge to speak, that rising pressure in your chest, that flutter of anxiety, that compulsion to be heard. Simply notice without judgment, because judgment will cause you to suppress the awareness rather than develop it. This noticing builds the foundation for change. Once you can see the pattern, once you can feel the urge before acting on it, you have created a gap between stimulus and response. That gap is where power lives. That gap is what separates Rockefeller from the railroad magnates, what separates old money from new money, what separates the person who controls their life from the person whose life is controlled by unconscious reactions and social programming. After a week of awareness, begin the practice of deliberate pause. Start small because dramatic changes will feel unnatural and unsustainable. When someone asks you a question, pause for 3 full seconds before answering. This will feel like an eternity initially. It will feel awkward and strange, and you will want to fill it immediately. Resist. Count in your head if you must. 1, 2, 3. Then speak. Do this with every question for 1 week. You will notice several things. First, your answers will be better because you have given yourself time to think, rather than reacting reflexively. Second, people will unconsciously begin to view you as more thoughtful and considered because your responses are not automatic. Third, you will start to become comfortable with that 3-second gap, and what once felt intolerable will start to feel natural. This is your nervous system adapting, building new neural pathways, learning that silence is safe. After a week of 3-second pauses, extend to 5 seconds. Then 7. Find your natural range, the pause length that feels authentic to you while still creating that slight pressure that communicates thoughtfulness and self-possession. In negotiations, whether business or personal, practice the strategic non-response. When someone makes an offer or proposal, do not immediately accept or reject or counter. Instead, simply acknowledge that you heard them. I understand. I see. Interesting. Then be silent. Let them sit with their own proposal. Watch what happens. More often than not, they will continue speaking. They will elaborate. They will sometimes modify their own offer without any input from you, talking themselves to a position more favorable to you than their initial offering. They might reveal the urgency behind their proposal, the deadline they are operating under, the alternatives they have or lack. All of this information makes your position stronger, and you gained it simply by not speaking, by resisting the trained impulse to immediately respond, by creating that vacuum and letting them fill it. Practice this technique in low-stakes situations first. Practice it when someone is trying to sell you something you don't need. Practice it in casual negotiations where the outcome doesn't matter much. Build the muscle memory, the comfort with the discomfort, the confidence in the technique. Then when you find yourself in a situation that truly matters, the skill will be available to you because you have trained it into your automatic behavior. The art of the question must be mentioned here because strategic silence is not absolute silence, but rather selective silence. And questions are one of the most powerful forms of selective speech. Rockefeller asked questions, but his questions were carefully chosen to extract maximum information while revealing minimum assumption. He would ask open-ended questions that required expansive answers. How do you see the market developing? Rather than, do you think oil prices will rise? The first question gives the responder freedom to reveal their entire analysis, their assumptions, their blind spots, their hopes and fears. The second question can be answered with a single word and reveals nothing. He would ask questions and then be silent, allowing the answer to expand naturally without cutting it off or redirecting it. Most people ask a question and then immediately follow it with another question or with their own thoughts, preventing the responder from fully developing their answer. This is a tremendous waste of opportunity. The full answer, the complete expansion that comes when someone is given space and silence to think and speak, contains the most valuable information. Learn to ask a question and then shut up. Truly shut up. Not waiting for your turn to speak, shut up, but genuinely interested in hearing everything they have to say, shut up. The difference is palpable, and the results are dramatically different. As we move toward the conclusion of this exploration, we must address the obvious irony that I have spent thousands of words talking about the power of silence. This is itself a lesson. Knowledge about silence must be transmitted through words. Understanding silence requires explanation, but the moment you step from knowledge into practice, the words must stop, and the silence must begin. Reading about silence is worth approximately nothing if you do not then practice silence. Understanding the psychological mechanisms is academically interesting but practically useless until you deploy them in real situations with real stakes. Rockefeller did not read books about silence. He practiced silence. He sat in rooms with powerful men and did not speak. He endured the discomfort and the pressure and the compulsion to fill the space. He did the thing rather than learning about the thing. And that made all the difference. That is always what makes the difference. Theory is cheap. Practice is expensive. Results come only from the expensive investment of practice, of doing the uncomfortable thing repeatedly until it becomes comfortable, of being in the arena rather than in the stands. The final principle to understand is that silence is not absence, but presence. This is perhaps the most subtle and most important distinction. When Rockefeller was silent in that boardroom, he was not absent from the interaction. He was intensely present, more present than anyone else in the room. His attention was total. His observation was complete. His analysis was ongoing. His silence was not empty, but full of awareness and intelligence and strategic calculation. This is what separates powerful silence from mere quietness. The quiet person who says nothing because they have nothing to say, or because they are anxious or disengaged, creates a very different effect than the person who chooses silence from a position of strength and fills that silence with intense presence and attention. Others can feel the difference, even if they cannot articulate it. They can sense when silence comes from power versus when it comes from weakness. Your silence must be Rockefeller's silence, not the silence of someone who has checked out, or who lacks confidence, or who simply has nothing to contribute. Your silence must communicate that you are so present, so aware, so engaged, that you do not need to speak to prove it. Your silence must have weight and substance and intelligence behind it. Otherwise, it is just emptiness, and emptiness has no power. Rockefeller died in 1937, having lived 97 years and having built and then witnessed the forced breakup of the largest business empire America had yet seen. In his later years, he became known for his philanthropy, giving away more than $500 million in an era when that represented unimaginable wealth. He funded universities and medical research and public health initiatives that saved millions of lives. The fortune he built through techniques like strategic silence was ultimately used for enormous public good. But the techniques themselves remain, outliving the man, waiting to be rediscovered and reapplied by each generation. The specific contexts change. The railroads become the internet. The oil fields become data centers. The boardrooms become video calls. But the fundamental dynamics of human psychology remain constant. The person who speaks reveals. The person who listens learns. The person who can tolerate silence better than their counterpart controls the interaction. The person who understands information asymmetry can extract value from every exchange. These truths do not age because they are rooted in the architecture of the human nervous system, in the social programming we all share, in the predictable patterns of behavior that emerge from primate brains navigating status hierarchies. You now know what Rockefeller knew. You understand the mechanics and the psychology. You have been given the tools and the techniques. The question is whether you will use them, whether you will do the uncomfortable work of practice, whether you will resist your training and your instincts and your compulsions in service of this higher strategic awareness. Most people who encounter this information will find it interesting and then do nothing with it. They will continue their pattern of speaking too much and listening too little, of revealing too much and learning too little, of responding too quickly and thinking too shallowly. This is fine. The world needs people who talk, who volunteer information freely, who fill every silence with sound. These people make it possible for the practitioners of strategic silence to thrive. But if you have read this far, if you have stayed with this exploration through thousands of words, you are probably not content to be in the category of people who talk. You probably sense, correctly, that there is another game being played beneath the visible game, that there are levels of sophistication in human interaction that you have not yet accessed, that power and influence flow in channels that are invisible to most people. You are right. Those channels exist. Rockefeller navigated them with masterful skill. And now you can too, if you choose practice over theory, if you choose discipline over instinct, if you choose silence over speech in those crucial moments when silence serves you better. The boardroom has changed, but the principles have not. The technology has evolved, but human psychology has not. The century has turned, but the game remains the same. Speak less, listen more. Be present in your silence. Let others fill the vacuum. Collect information while revealing none. Control the tempo. Manage your nervous system. Question strategically. Pause deliberately. And when you finally speak, make it count. These techniques built the greatest business empire of the industrial age. What will you build with them? The choice, as always, is yours, but choose quickly, because while you have been reading, someone else has been practicing. Someone else has been sitting in silence, watching, learning, waiting. Someone else is already playing the game at a level you are only now beginning to understand. The question is not whether you will catch up. The question is whether you will even try. Now go. Close your mouth. Open your eyes. And watch what happens when you stop filling the world with your voice and start filling your mind with what others reveal in the vacuum of your silence. Rockefeller found infinite wealth in that silence. What will you find?